What do Koch Industries, owned by the conservative Koch brothers, the ACLU, and the liberal Ford Foundation have in common? Well, usually not much, but recently they came together in a broad coalition that they say is going to invest millions of dollars in confronting criminal justice reform. They're worried about overcrowding, they're worried about innocent people behind bars, and there's probably more to it too. But none of that has our next guest reassured. Her name is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She's a professor at the City University of New York Graduate Center, and she's the author of the book Golden Gulag: Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is also a founding member of Critical Resistance, the anti-prison movement. Ruth, welcome. Glad to have you.
It's good to be here.
I am sure that you, like me, saw that announcement about the Koch, Ford, Center for American Progress, ACLU coming together story, and your mind kind of boggled, or did it? What was your reaction?
They might accomplish something useful. I can't say no. They've got so many resources. They might do something that will have a beneficial effect for certain kinds of people who have been incarcerated either for long periods of time or, as it were, in and out, and maybe for some of the communities where those people come from. However, what worries me the most is that the kind of rhetoric that has accompanied these kinds of bipartisan consensuses that we can see in the experience that many of us had in California last fall with Proposition 47 is to harden the system for everybody who doesn't stand to benefit from it.
So give us an example of the rhetoric.
Okay, the rhetoric was this law, Proposition 47, which would change the sentencing for certain kinds of low-level property offenses. So far, so good. This law is written so that certain kinds of people will never get out of prison. Yeah. Why bother? Why bother? Most people get out of prison. So saying that hardens in rhetoric and also in practice a system that, although it declined on a national level between 2010 and 2012, shot back up again in 2013.
You've pointed out many times that it's not just the right who've been responsible for increasing penalties for certain crimes that lead to extended periods of incarceration for folks. Has the sort of liberal edge of the spectrum learned anything? And I was shocked to see Maxine Waters, one of the most progressive people in Congress, had been part of this process that you describe in your book.
Willie Brown, who was a very, very powerful person in California politics for a long time, served as the Speaker of the California State Assembly for many years. And in the early 80s, he, a member of the Democratic Party, but embraced by both of the dominant parties, said, sooner or later, everyone is going to have to kneel before the altar of prisons. And this goes back to the question of legitimacy, state legitimacy, public sector legitimacy. And he was indeed right, and we still are living the long-term effects of his having been correct in the fact that prisons have become almost quasi-religious in so far as people imagine that they are necessary at the scale and scope to which they've developed over the last 30 years.
And what gives you reason to believe, or maybe a glimpse, of another possibility or another set of possibilities? Do you have a vision of how we could do this differently?
Oh, man, we just take the money and start again. All right, that's a short answer, but how do we get there?
Yeah.
The long answer. Well, over the years, I've been working with all different kinds of people in many walks of life, both here in the States and abroad. South Africa, Portugal, I mean, a wide variety of places. And one of the things that we've noticed is wherever capital wields a big stick, i.e. a big stick against worker organizing, a big stick against good pay and benefits, wherever capital wields a big stick, the all-purpose use of prisons is more prevalent. That also means wherever inequality is deep, the use of prisons is more prevalent. So the United States is first, Russia is second, the UK is third, and so forth. And South Africa is up there as well. But So where I find hope is in thinking about and working with people who are indeed themselves organizing modestly educated people in the prime of life. I get hope from thinking about the fact that certain people who are active in the AFL-CIO Central Council on a national scale are focusing now on mass incarceration and trying to get off the false scent of thinking the problem is private prisons and onto the true scent, which is that resources that can go to salaries and well-being are going into prison. And this brings us back to what the Coke Industries guys are up to. If there's one thing Coke Industries has done, it's been to smash unions, smash unions, smash unions. And while they might, as individuals, the Koch brothers, and as a bunch of shareholders, think that the laws criminalizing so many people in the United States have gone too far. The fact is they are not at all interested in restoring the power of, let's say, American labor,
Right.
which is absolutely necessary, both for people who are documented not to work, and that's the 65 million or more who have been through prison in the United States, as well as those who are not documented to work, the immigrants who are vulnerable to criminalization and deportation. So that's a lot of people. That's like 90 million people. So I get hope from thinking how many people might be, and indeed in some organizations are, focused on turning over or overturning this heinous system.
And what do you consider a non-reformist reform?
A non-reformist reform is any reform that does not extend the life or the scope of the prison industrial complex. So,
Yeah, give us
a
an example.
non-reformist reform would be to decriminalize, let's say, drug possession. This is not my goal, but is what many people are for. As long as that reform doesn't say, but certain other people should go to prison longer. Right? A non-reformist reform is one in which people understand that something as individualized as compassionate release for people who are in prison for part or all of their lives, who face mortal illnesses, that compassionate release is not a replacement for complete recalibration of sentences in general. It's non-reformist reform is actually a pretty simple idea that that every abolitionist uses as a test before entering into an alliance with people who aren't necessarily ready now or ever to say abolition is what our goal is.
And when you say abolition, prison abolition, explain to folks what that looks like for you. What do you mean by that?
Prison abolition is a way of imagining a world in which interpersonal harm, economic need, social and health vulnerability are things of the past. Prison abolition is a way of imagining a world in which people don't solve problems by raising their hands at one another, that people do not imagine that the only way to get help and have their welfare looked after is by going to prison, that people don't imagine that the kinds of ordinary social disorders that we all experience, whether we live in big cities like New York or in quiet little rural communities, that we all experience are best dealt with through criminalization and punishment. So prison abolition is actually about imagining a world that is a different order. And when I say that, I don't mean pie in the sky, but rather look at what people do today to solve problems. So Insight Women of Color Against Violence, who have been working very hard to figure out alternate ways to deal with something that's extremely frightening, which is domestic violence. Or to look in the past and see how the black people in the South under Reconstruction built entire societies, you know, it appears from nothing, but obviously they were building societies from what their dreams were of a society when slavery would no longer exist. But they understood that freedom wasn't merely the absence of enslavement, but it was the presence of certain kinds of social and political and economic relationships that emerged in that place as things like public education and universal voting, including children.
So that gets to the question of how do we redirect all the energies that get produced, fear and trauma, in a media environment that gives us stories all the time that are really scary about crime, particularly in our neighborhoods?
This is such a good question. And it's in answering this question that I imagine the kind of anarchy of social media can play a fantastically important role. And that is to say that people are, especially but not only young people, are experiencing a wide variety of accounts of things that through the mainstream media, whether it's broadcast or cable, is only ever organized through reminding you of whom you should be frightened all the time. So that's one thing. Another thing that comes to mind, and I think it's because I'm on camera, is that people, all different kinds of people, learn to use fear for something other than suppressing the self. I have stage fright. I have a really bad stage fright. And an actor years ago taught me how to use that fear to come across as an energetic and engaged interlocutor, right? So we can use our fear to get to somewhere else. Now, somebody in the audience is probably thinking, yeah, but if somebody, comes at you with a fist or a weapon, what are you going to do? Well, sometimes fear is appropriate. I'm not a fool. And I don't think anybody listening to us today is foolish, but we have this sensibility. It's a feeling of what's possible in the world that we can actually alter. We can change how we feel. Cedric Robinson, who was one of my mentors, who wrote a brilliant book called Black Marxism, remarked recently that experience is important, but consciousness is what matters. It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And if we could be conscious of how we experience things and then direct our energy, and we have a lot of energy when you're frightened, towards something that would be more conducive to resolving the relations that produce fear, then perhaps we'll get where we need to go. I mean, remember that Darren Wilson was exculpated not once but twice for the killing, the extra-legal killing of Michael Brown by convincing people that he was frightened. And this is where I have a hard time with this particular bipartisan coalition that is gathered together under the brand of Koch Industries and so forth, and that is that Newt Gingrich, who in the Contract on America back in 1994 was calling for everybody to support building as many prisons as it takes, now says, well, prison is for the people we're afraid of, not for the people we're just mad at. Well, afraid isn't good enough. There have to be other ways that we think about the problem of harm and what to do about it, and that we get away from thinking that all crime is about harm rather than how we have organized our entire social order.
You describe in your book, Golden Gulag, a community of mothers who come together and actually redirect that energy through meetings and through working together and coming to understand each other and the system better to make some real change in California. I'm going to encourage people to check it out in the book. Are there groups out there working in the U.S. today that inspire you in the same kind of way? I don't know whether Black Lives Matter is the one you would name, but...
Black Lives Matter has been so inspirational to me. I want to give a shout out to Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi and all of the people who, putting their thought into combination with those three amazing, strong, wonderful women, have started chapters around North America and abroad called Black Lives Matter. I work with young people of Cabo Verdean descent in Portugal, young meaning in their teens through 30s, who have started a Black Lives Matter chapter there as well. And what they're doing in Portugal. And what I think some of the chapters here in the States, in North America, I should say, are doing is to get past the immediate and heinous and heartbreaking incidents and try to think about what the underlying social order is that has produced the possibility that police can blow away Black people with no consequence. And so one thing that I understand people active in Black Lives Matters understand is that the capacity to kill is actually a precondition for the capacity to incarcerate. And so we have to address both of those problems. And in order to do that, we have to think about the entire social order. What kind of economy do we want to live in? And how can we organize it in the richest country in the history of the world?
You describe the massive expansion of incarceration, the building of prisons, coinciding with economic shifts. Right now, we're looking at an environmental shift in the state that you've studied, California, with the declaration of this drought, worst in centuries. What do you think will come of this, and will it have an effect on this situation that you've discovered and covered in Golden Gulag?
That's a great question. I'd like to think that the scarcity of water in California's Central Valley, which is where most of the new prisons in that state have been built, will provide more compelling pressure on the state of California to close prisons that many people, many kinds of advocates and activists have been trying to get the state to close for some time. However, there's a flip side to this that's really quite interesting and a little bit shocking, and that is periodically in California there have been issues, crises concerning water, and although this year the situation is worse than ever, 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago, people thought that that year was the worst year ever. One of the arguments that California made in support of building prisons and taking agricultural land out of production was to say, if we take the land out of production, we'll use less water. So a prison is a good thing because although it's a city, it uses less water than, say, land devoted to growing cotton.
So we could see it go either way, which makes this an important moment for activism and change. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Golden Gulag is the book. We'll have a link at our website. Check it out. Did you know you could be arrested for, quote, manifesting an intent to commit a crime? Monica
When prisoners in Alabama last spring proposed a national strike to protest prison slavery, they called out the infamous clause in the 13th Amendment. The amendment, most known for abolishing slavery, included a rider that sanctioned slavery as punishment for a crime wherein the party shall have been duly convicted. That exception provides the foundation for Ava DuVernay's The 13th, an exploration of racial criminalization from the end of slavery to the present. The documentary features interviews with several leading scholars, pundits, and activists working on the issue, as well as a host of other commentators, including journalists and politicians. It moves quickly through more than 150 years of history, with a clear goal of providing the backdrop to the present moment of racial violence and resistance. Kalief Browder, 1993 to 2015. By Jennifer Gunnerman, photo by Zach Gross. Kalief Browder, 1993 to 2015, by Jennifer Gunnerman, photo by Zach Gross. The film is at its best when it chronicles individual fates of those who encounter the carceral state. For example, the tragedy of Kalief Browder, the 22-year-old New Yorker who committed suicide after being held for 3 years in Rikers Island awaiting trial on charges, ultimately dropped, of having stolen a backpack, is portrayed with wrenching grace. Browder's courage is evident in his refusal to accept a plea bargain for something he did not do. Yet the violence he faced during his imprisonment, some of it captured on film, led him to take his own life after his release. The film also presents a thoughtful, searing discussion among Black scholars and activists about the ethics of visualizing Black suffering, from lynching to contemporary killings by police. The 13th effectively demonstrates that criminalization has been a persistent feature of anti-Black racism. It shows the recursive nature of law and order politics, as DuVernay juxtaposes scenes from Trump's speeches and rallies with police and vigilante attacks on Black activists in the 1960s. Such scenes, with the accompanying commentary, vindicate the mission, purpose, and structure of Black Lives Matter as the latest manifestation of a long struggle against criminalization. The footage underscores Malkia Cyril's powerful comment that Black Lives Matter is about changing the way this country understands human dignity. The 13th describes mass incarceration as a backlash to the civil rights and Black Power movements, with some compelling footage of Black Panther Assata Shakur and other activists. Yet the film focuses more on what FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and President Nixon thought than on what they, or others, did. The reference by CNN contributor Van Jones to the imprisonment, exile, or death of Black activists in the 1960s appears only in the context of why there was not more opposition to the 1994 crime bill rather than as part of examining the foundations of mass incarceration in the political repression of 1960s-era social movements. The film does not discuss the policies that gave greater power to police, prosecutors, and prisons in those critical years. Mass incarceration is the recent expression of a larger edifice of carceral power. It is a political project that began in response to the rebellious social movements in U.S. cities and prisons during the 1960s. It began with state and national politicians giving greater resources and authority to police and prosecutors and expanding the criminal code before embarking on the world's biggest prison construction program. It now maintains an interlinked system of policing, surveillance, and imprisonment concentrated on the most marginalized sectors of society. Mass incarceration began through twin campaigns of targeted anti-radicalism alongside the broad political-economic destabilization of working-class communities of color in the 1960s. It was not simply the evolution of racial caste, as Michelle Alexander states. Rather, mass incarceration has always been a bipartisan political project of social control, a counter-revolution by liberals and conservatives alike. It is too narrow to, as the film does, date mass incarceration to Ronald Reagan's expansion of the war on drugs in the 1980s and Bill Clinton's 1994 crime bill. That puts the onus on federal prison policy, when 90% of the 2.3 million people incarcerated in this country are in state prisons and local jails. Prisons, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore documents in Golden Gulag, were the state-by-state geographic solution to the American government in crisis. 9780520242012. In discussing the time between Bill Clinton's presidency and the present, the film makes several significant factual errors. It states that arrests spiked after the 1994 crime bill, when arrests have actually fallen since that time. The bill's more pernicious effects concern sentencing policy, not arrest rates. It shows a graph claiming that the prison population has expanded dramatically since 2010, when incarceration rates have plateaued or even fallen since that time. And it says that Black men account for 40% of the prison population, which has not been the case for several years. Although Black people remain dramatically overrepresented in prisons, the last several years have seen the number of Black men in prison drop and the number of white and Latino men, as well as women of all races, rise. The prison system is racist and violent, but in ways that constantly evolve. Presenting old statistics or inventing new ones overlooks the deadly dynamism of mass incarceration. It can also reinscribe some of the same connections between Blackness and criminality that the film seeks to interrupt, such as the mistaken idea taken from Bureau of Justice Statistics projections and debunked by Professor Ivory Toldson that there are more Black men in prison than in college, or that 1 in 3 Black men will serve time in prison. The film also suggests that mass incarceration is a profit-driven system controlled by the American Legislative Executive Council (ALEC), the shadowy lobbying group of major corporations and mostly Republican officials. The 13th implies that mass incarceration is driven by private prisons and prison labor, and that ALEC oversees this nefarious scheme. These claims are simply false. As loathsome as ALEC is, it is a minor player in a complex network of public and private interests shaping crime policy. And as the Prison Policy Initiative has documented, private prisons account for less than 10% of the overall prison population in the United States and are now at the front lines of pursuing privatized alternatives to incarceration rather than mass incarceration itself. The one exception is in the realm of immigrant detention, where more than 70% of detainees are held in privately run facilities. Beyond inflating the role of ALEC and companies like the Corrections Corporation of America, this focus on private prisons obscures the real ways money moves through or is extracted from the prison system, including both the vast expenditure of public funds dedicated to caging human beings as well as the nefarious ways private companies seek to profit off of incarceration. The film does cover the exorbitant rates charged for phone calls incarcerated people make to their loved ones, but only after the long and misleading emphasis on private prisons. Private companies, especially private prison companies, are not the driving forces of mass incarceration. They are the venal byproducts of racial state violence in a capitalist society. And as these entities now seek to steer the ship of prison reform, blaming ALEC for mass incarceration overlooks the true centers of gravity in the terrifying evolution of carceral control. It leaves students or others fired up by the film's moral power with few places to turn to express their outrage. Such missteps muddle the issue of where mass incarceration comes from or what it means to end it. One would be hard-pressed to find more astute analysts of racial criminalization and mass incarceration than Malkia Cyril, Angela Davis, Marie Gottschalk, James Kilgore, Khalil Muhammad, and some of the other commentators who appear in the film. Yet they appear alongside several people who have promoted and upheld anti-black, free market solutions, first to crime and now to mass incarceration. The film makes no narrative intervention to differentiate between its many interviewees, suggesting they are all equally reliable and trustworthy experts. While the cacophony of voices in the film, 38 interviewees in 100 minutes, may be meant to suggest the breadth of voices opposed to the American carceral state, in practice it normalizes some dangerous or misleading analyses. Some of the most robust avenues for understanding mass incarceration are unexplored in the film. The loudest silence is the inattention to women's incarceration as well as the incarceration of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. As many do, the 13th treats mass incarceration as only a story of black men in prison. Yet while women have always been a small percentage of the overall number of prisoners, their rate of incarceration, especially for black women, has been higher than men. The film also overlooks the other labor women and queer and trans people do as a result of mass incarceration in maintaining families and communities. Other distinctive, and distinctly racist, areas of American prisons, such as the death penalty and long-term solitary confinement, are barely mentioned or overlooked entirely. DuVernay is exactly right to insist that criminalization has been and remains yoked to racism. And she has assembled some of the sharpest minds, if also, sadly, some of the dullest, to excavate why that is the case. The end result, however, is underwhelming. Overall, the film is too inattentive to the historical ebb and flow of racial criminalization,